Welcome to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach, and I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Neil Nemeth. Neil is the author of News Ombudsman and Social Responsibility, to my immediate right, and Dr. Lee Artz, who is the author of The Media Globe. And our topic today is Ebola and why this is the media event that it is. So, Neil, I'd like to start with you. And ask you, are there more newsworthy healthcare topics, and why are we talking about Ebola?
Well, it's out of the norm. By definition, news is something that does not happen every day. And in the aftermath of coverage of things going on in Africa, I think it's only natural that media organizations, particularly the news media, would focus attention on this. And of course, the question is how much of what is being reported. And a lot of the coverage in the cable television aspect of it, where there's 24/7 space to fill, I think is the area where if there are problems, there are significant problems. And one of the challenges, of course, is that they've got time to fill, and sometimes there is no news to present. But it's a natural.
Can you give me an example of something that sort of is fill as opposed to being substantive?
Well, it would be any sort of speculation on transmission of the disease, anything that is not really supported by facts. And of course, on cable particularly, the number of resources devoted to reporting is necessarily limited. So again, you're going to have a lot of people sitting around speculating, and the real question is, what service does that provide to the rest of us?
Do journalists have to provide a service? Is it enough that they're talking about something that people are interested in? Or?
Well, I would hope that there be some substance to the talk and not just talk.
Yeah.
After all, public health is a significant public issue, and if you accept the challenge of media, news media particularly, to work in the public interest, so to speak, then sharing factual information about the nature of the risk involved and the steps being taken by governmental authorities to place us at the most minimal risk as possible, those are the things that should be covered. And if there's a gap, then that's probably where it is.
Still, we have a situation where less than half a dozen people have been infected.
In the U.S.
In the U.S., of course, yes. Lee, what's the political side of this? What do you think is contributing to it there?
Well, I think there's a couple ways we could talk about this. One, we could talk about the cable news and the fact that they do, I think primarily they provide filler. They don't really provide news anyway. That would be my critique. I think there's plenty of news out there that would be appropriate to share with the American public, but I don't think it gets presented because it doesn't fit their agenda. But I was talking with Neil before the show that if we just take the basic 5 W's of journalism, I think it's kind of reveals the politics behind the media coverage. For instance, if we started with when does this become news? This isn't the first outbreak of Ebola.
Right.
There was an outbreak in 1976 of Ebola in what was called Zaire in Democratic Republic of Congo now that was questionable about the militarization of bio hazards.
Right.
There was an outbreak in 1995. Several hundred people died again. It was in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but we didn't hear much coverage of that. And then we talk about when do we talk about Ebola outbreak, or when do we talk about the causes of Ebola. One thing you don't get on any of the cable networks is, where does Ebola come from? It's a virus. It comes from small animals and it's transmitted to humans. And it comes primarily because people are eating small mammals, even fruit bats. Well, why? Do people just run out into the bush and start eating small mammals? I mean, it's because about 3 years ago, major agribusinesses, United States, Swiss, Chinese,
French.
Malaysian, French, yes, started buying. Buying is a friendly word. They basically took the land. Over 15,000 acres, 1/3 of the deforestation in the world in the last 10 years happened in West Africa. Well, what happens when you cut down the forests to put up biofuel like corn? Well, you move all the farmers out of there, and the habitat for the animals that live there are moved. So you have people moving and animals that are infected moving, and the diet of the people that no longer have the ability to grow their own food becomes the animals. And the animals are the carriers of the disease. It's like you could predict, if you were doing a movie for some health action movie,
Right.
you could have set this up. So it's like, surprise. No, it's not a surprise. It was there in 76, it was there in 95, it was there in 2010. It really doesn't become a story till somebody gets on a plane and comes to Atlanta, Georgia. Now it's a story. Now it's unusual, because Africans dying, agribusiness taking over farmland, that's not news, you're right. That has become the new normal. What's new is that there's an American dying from it.
Proximity, though,
Yeah.
has always been a dominant news value. And now that it is
There was
perceived
no
to be on our
proximity when
turf.
somebody got their head cut off in Syria. That's not proximate to us. It wasn't. It's nowhere near us.
Well, it is,
becomes
because if
news.
it's an American.
Precisely. That's my point.
Yeah.
And that's the
Well,
politics. of it.
proximity has always been one of the criteria for news value, right? Novelty, right? Conflict, right? The list, and certainly proximity is a factor here. But I just want to get back to something that Neil brought up. So we're getting a lot of coverage on the cable news channels that is maybe in excess of the quality of. They're doing more coverage than they have actually news to report, essentially, right? To put it nicely.
Yes.
Now, so you've just outlined a pretty interesting backstory here. So the question is, why doesn't somebody at one of these cable channels get a little bit curious and try to cover that? I mean, and if they did cover that, would somebody shut that down, or what keeps that from coming out?
Well, I think it depends which one you're talking about. CNN,
Yeah.
Fox, whether you like them or dislike them, they're there.
Yeah.
MSNBC has made it clear that they are not a news source. They have commentaries about public events and public affairs, but they really do not have their own news staff. And of course, their ratings reflect that. Their ratings are very low at this point in time.
Well, what about the New York Times or Washington Post? What about one of the premier newspapers? Why isn't this story coming out? Why aren't we looking at the causes?
Well, I think there's probably more in the New York Times than there would be in the Hammond Times or the Chicago
Sure.
Tribune, because proximity for the premier newspaper in the United States is really the world.
Right.
Right? It's not just the New
Right.
York Times audience is not primarily people that live in the Midwest
Right.
even. Their audience is an international elite. So
Plus, they've taken over the Herald Tribune, so they're the
right, if you read,
newspaper for
yes,
the world.
that's right.
now.
So in that sense, I would say they probably give us more news and information.
I
than
didn't
our
see
local
this
daily
story in
paper.
there, though.
No, but you could. That story isn't there because even the New York Times, as big as it is, does not have an international bureau in West Africa.
Well, how long did it take you to figure this out?
I would say at this point, Wikipedia is probably a better source than any newspaper in the United
Well, I mean,
States.
so what keeps a journalist? I was a journalist for a few years, and I remember scrounging around for story ideas. Where's the enterprise here?
Well, one of the challenges, again, is that the amount of money that has been devoted to news gathering has been significantly diminished. I think it's relevant that Ben Bradley, the great editor of the Washington Post, died in this past week, and some of the commentaries in the aftermath of all of that suggest that he would be very aggressive in asking a lot of questions, particularly about governmental officials, about what they are doing, what plans do they have, what plans do they want to put in place to try and make the protection against problems like this as significant as possible. But the Post, and of course he had for a long time a family that was willing to devote significant resources to
Right.
doing this sort of thing.
Katie Graham.
Well, yes, Catherine Graham and her son, But they eventually gave up the good fight because the Post was no longer a profit-making venture for them. They're making a lot of their money from other holdings that they had within the Washington Post company. So times have really changed, and to some extent, Bradley's passing in this past week is kind of a little bit of a reminder that, you know, the sort of resources that are there and the dogged determination are not in as great a supply as they were 40 years ago.
Well, you're agreeing with Lee then that you can get better coverage on this on Wikipedia than in the news?
Not day-to-day coverage, I would say. Background on Ebola. If you want to know what causes Ebola and what the history of Ebola is, you're probably better off going to Wikipedia than thinking you're going to get it in the local
I'm just
newspaper.
trying to pick a fight.
Well, no, and there's no fight because the orientation of news coverage is episodic. What you want is a summary, I think, of everything we know about it at this point in time. I suppose if one were able to piece together news accounts over a period of time, it would be possible to come up with that account.
Yeah.
But the plain fact of the matter is, with a daily deadline, the likelihood of getting a comprehensive count of anything is pretty limited, simply because there are deadlines that have to be met, people who aren't available, documents that are not available, errors that are made because for whatever reason we can't fact check what's going on. I think to some extent we're talking about the limitations of storytelling as a means of conveying factual information.
Interesting point along those lines. The movie Contagion came out a year ago, maybe it's more than that, but I think it was last year. And it really did tell the whole story. It actually followed this contagious disease coming into America, similar to the plot that we're going through right now, only it gets out of hand, of course. And at the end of the film, it shows how it started, and it shows a bat flying over some fruit and leaving some droppings on the fruit, and then I think it was bananas or something, and it shows that getting processed. And
but what was the purpose? Was the purpose to produce a documentary, or was it an entertainment vehicle?
It was entertainment, but it was a documentary style entertainment, and in telling the story in 2 hours or less, you know, they really did manage to encompass the kinds of things that Lee's talking about.
And I would say, with the exception of a handful of papers, most of the papers in this country are not interested in news, even as Neil would express it, but they are interested in the same thing that Contagion was. We call it infotainment. It's not like they fabricate it. It's not like they don't have the story, but how are they going to tell this story? So it has to be dramatized. It has to be extremely personalized. So if you read a story in a typical daily newspaper in the United States, it's going to be a story about, you know, John and his wife and where they live and the color of the paint in the house and how many doctors came to see him, and it becomes a little story, which is what? Does that help us understand Ebola? Does that understand the context of it? No, but it gets interest. It entertains us.
We're human beings, and we're subject to, you know, having our interest being taken up by those things. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and Calumet Roundtable will be right back. Thank you. Welcome back to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. My guests today, across from me, are Dr. Lee Artz, and next to me, Dr. Neil Nemeth. And we were talking about how, in some ways, the movie Contagion gave us a broader, deeper understanding of a situation like Ebola than maybe we're getting from some of the news coverage. Let me just take another angle on that. Do you think that, that the fact that there have been movies like Contagion and Outbreak, and that people are still watching these and they're still having them in mind, do you think that makes us a sexier topic and makes people more interested in it? Are we, are we kind of voyeuristically putting ourselves in a situation here? Either of you? No?
Well, I think it may be that cultural experience of watching a movie is about the only frame we have to understand this outbreak. I think that might subconsciously be taking place in the larger public, which is why you end up with hysterics like people wanting to keep their kids out of the school, or the governors of New York, well, I guess he's backed off, but the governor of New Jersey wants to quarantine anybody that's been to Liberia. Some politicians want to have a travel ban. All of that has nothing to do with Ebola, has very little to do with the contagious nature of Ebola, and has a lot to do with what, I guess for lack of a better explanation,
Right.
learning from the movies, or learning from the popular depictions of an outbreak like Ebola, which is, I think, is a sad commentary on our culture, and I think it's even a worse critique of the media itself. That,
but it's also a political judgment as well.
oh, absolutely.
Yes, so perhaps I would say that it's even more tragic, if you will, that politicians are thinking in these ways.
Well, since 9/11, if not before, they've been thinking in the ways of fear, and this certainly plays into that. I mean, there's a fear, we got to be afraid of Ebola, so what does that mean? You lose all your civil rights, you turn them over to me, and I'm going to protect you. And I'm not making that up. That's the headlines of the papers. I mean,
Well, politically nobody's suggesting that.
well, that's about what Christie said.
Really?
Yes, right? I mean, there's a threat here. People from Liberia are going to be...
Is he closing the bridge again?
No, but the woman that came back, who is a nurse, who does not have Ebola, she has been quarantined to a tent without a shower, with no contact with anybody else for 21 days, against her will, and against all scientific evidence. But I'm sure it fits to some of the talk shows that Neil's referencing, that this is what should be done.
And also the governor's presidential aspirations in 2016.
Right, to show he has a better response than Obama. But,
Right.
yeah.
And also to try and get out of the people's minds the bridge incident that you talked about.
Right.
Sometimes I think an event like this tell us more about the world we live in than the event itself.
Yeah.
I mean, if I saw 2 days ago, I saw the BBC headlines that says Cuba sends doctors to Liberia, and on the same day on Reuters it says U.S. sends 3,000 troops to Africa, which, without intending it, to me it was a very indicative of the responses of different countries in the world. Yeah. Every response the U.S. has is a military response. They're sending 3,000 troops. Yeah. If anybody thinks that they're going there for charitable reasons, it's like, just think back to wherever else troops have been sent.
What can 3,000 troops do for an Ebola outbreak?
Well, yeah, I mean, partly it's a commentary on the U.S. medical system. How many medical doctors outside of Doctors Without Borders have gone? Yeah. Whereas you got what did BBC say? I got it. Cuba
Yes.
is now the biggest provider of healthcare workers to the Ebola crisis in West Africa, more than the Red Cross or richer nations.
Okay.
And what does the U.S. send? 3,000 troops, and they can't send them now. They might send them sometime in the future. To do what? Right? I mean, they're going to construct something. They don't need new buildings. You put tents up. They need doctors. They need medical workers. Right. They need a vaccine that hasn't been researched because there's been cuts. All across the board, there's been cuts. And again, I think it's more indicative of the world we live. I mean, I think Dr. Nemeth's right. It tells us about the politics as much as it tells us about the media. Although the media could find out, they haven't. But you're right, they are accurately reporting what the political leaders are doing.
Well, I think what you're suggesting, though, is getting back to a more populist agenda rather than reflecting the establishment, if you will, being the establishment being government and business particularly. And of course, that is criticized by a whole lot of powerful people as being too left. But if you go back into the history of journalism, 120 or 130 years ago, Pulitzer and Hearst, the two great moguls of the day, accumulated a huge amount of wealth, but their orientation was to populism, essentially, focusing on issues like income tax for the first time, putting in place child labor laws. They also resorted to sensationalist methods to get the immigrant populations, who quite frankly did not read all that well, to pay attention to their products. So it was a double-edged sword here. I think what has happened is that the business aspects of it have overwhelmed the desire to serve the populations.
Let's stick with politics for a second. To what extent do you think Obama's been responding to this as a media event as opposed to a healthcare issue? I mean, he had an initial response that seemed like he wasn't ready for it, and then it seemed like he almost overreacted. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, let's be honest. He's a lame duck president whose popularity is about 40% or less. His political party is in danger of losing the U.S. Senate in the upcoming midterm elections. He has, I think, an imperative from a political standpoint to appear that he is engaged and doing something about this problem, and so you see the result.
And you were talking about the sort of but still the penny press, right? The burgeoning penny press.
Well, this was a little bit later. This would be
Yeah.
1880.
Activist journalism.
Pulitzer and Hearst were really in their heyday in the last 20 years of the 19th century.
And early on in the 20th century, I guess during World War I, right, around 1917, 1918, there was a big flu epidemic, right? I think I recall reading that some countries lost more soldiers to the flu than they did to the fighting.
Well, even now, if you look for the Center for Disease Control, they'll tell you that if you take, I didn't see the breakdown, but HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, and diarrhea this year will kill 9 million people. I mean, if you're going to talk about an epidemic,
Right.
9 million people, and even if you separate them out for each of those particular diseases, it's still going to be a lot more than the 4,800 that died from Ebola, I guess, since March. 10,000 people have been infected, and about half of those have died from Ebola.
Right.
But again, to me, it's more of if we step back from Ebola, which you can't always do, but I mean, this could have easily been dealt with within a few weeks, except that the World Health Organization has had its budget cut by over 25%, by more than $1 billion in the last 2 years. The entire department at the World Health Organization for emergency response to epidemics was closed. They have one person that works at the UN for the WHO that deals with Ebola. Why? Well, it's because the major countries in the world, US, Eastern European Union, and the rest, have an idea that says everything should be privatized, get the government out of our affairs, turn this over to the big pharma to do the research, which they do none because there's no money to be made in it. And you have an outbreak, they're completely ill-equipped to do it. Something that could have been contained in a couple weeks. But they are, at this point, they have followed less than 8% of the people that have contracted Ebola. Do they know where they've gone?
Is that right? So they're only tracking them if they come to the United States?
Well, no, the World Health Organization in Liberia and Guinea and Nigeria, the people that have contracted Ebola, the first thing you want to do is who have they been in contact with?
Right.
Well, they've only been able, because of their staffing, to track about 8% of the people that come in contact with
Well,
it.
it's interesting because you can see what we did in the United States. So we've set an example of how this could be handled. And,
Well, again, I mean, if you're looking...
How it can be overhandled, right?
Right,
Yes.
well, if you're looking for an argument, the only guy that died, Thomas Duncan, why did he die?
Yeah.
He went to the hospital. He didn't have health insurance. They told him to go away.
So you're raising the social issues that are underlying this on both sides.
Well, of course. If we would have had health care like in any other civilized country on the face of the earth, if we had health care that did that, they would have said, you've got a temperature of 103, we'd like to look at you for 2 days. But the hospital said, they were quoted as saying, it was too big of risk to keep him overnight because we didn't think he could pay. So he comes back 2 days later and he's got raging Ebola, and who's he been in contact with, and he dies. Yeah. So that to me is not a commentary on the wonderfulness of the United States. It's like a commentary on the inability of a private healthcare system to deal with health. Right. Just like the US response to the World Health Organization is a commentary on how not to deal with healthcare for humanity. Right. I mean, there's so many levels of this that are all subsumed with the 24-hour news cycle on CNN. Right. That it's an embarrassment to anybody that's a media critic or studies media, and I would argue it's an embarrassment to anybody that's in support of democracy. It's just, right. It's just, in addition to the 5,000 people that are dead, it's just a huge insult to humanity that we continue to allow the people that are making the decisions to do that under the guise that they're functioning in our interests, and we're going to, keep her in a tent so she doesn't infect anybody.
Well, and the issue for us at the roundtable here, of course, is why isn't more of this being talked about and discussed in the news media? But that's all we have for today. Thank you for watching Calumet Roundtable and for joining me today with Dr. Lee Artz and Dr. Neil Nemeth. I'm your host, Tom Roach. Have a great day.